With the aim of encouraging broader participation in European politics, voters from the 28 European Union member states were given the opportunity in 2014 to show support for the European Commission President, who had the support of the major political parties. The process, however, was difficult to comprehend due to the following reasons. Firstly, such European leaders as Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, employed some delaying tactics when asked whether the ability to bestow power upon electors would be much vaunted. Another point to consider was the hypothetical technocratic nature of the European Commission and its valid legitimacy. Politicizing the elections would introduce, in fact, an ideological dimension to an entity that had judicial powers in regulating and sanctioning their competition in the common market. An additional reason was related to the desperate attempt to give Europe a joint face at a time when the Commission's influence was at its lowest ebb. During the years of 2009 and 2014, the European Parliament elections were marked by a financial and sovereign debt crisis that drastically challenged the European project. The continuity of the monetary union and the irreversibility of the EU membership were threatened particularly by the sticky situation in Greece. On the opposite side, Germany emerged as a true sovereign of Europe. When EU citizens went to the polls in May 2014, the continent was entrapped on the assumption that the euro might be badly designed. Undoing the currency at that time could have been presumably the worst of cases. As anticipated, the 2014 European elections witnessed the rise of Eurosceptic and radical parties from both extremes of the ideological spectrum. For instance, non-aligned members of the European Parliament, those who showed rejection to the European project, increased from 33 to 52 MEPs. In 2014, austerity policies had an impact on campaign discourse. To take an example, southern European countries had nearly 60% of videos with negative censure, around 33% of them being produced in the region, and only 2% out of the total being analysed. This was in stark contrast with the lucid optimistic mood in Eastern Europe, which represented 18% of the videos in the sample, but had about 31% of them evoking positive emotions. Although inflicting a somewhat pessimistic discourse, the economic downturn appeared to have shaped campaign videos in Southern Europe by other means, especially with an increase in real-life testimonies of hardships. From all appearances, meridional member states accounted for more than half of the videos, showcasing some factual stories, and also for a majority of the commercials with testimonial justifications. Eastern Europe, in equal manner, enjoyed its fair share of this kind of videoing. Continental Europe member states have offered the most European-focused videos. Eastern and Southern Europe have had around half of nationally centered videos, whereas 5% of them in each area were mainly concerned with Europe. It is not surprising to find that Southern European countries were a lot more involved in economic matters, as in the current recession, while accounting for a higher proportion of videos mainly dealing with unemployment. Within this region, 14% of ads took a stand in joblessness, and nearly 1/5 focused on the economic crisis. Encircling 75% of videos from Northern and Eastern Europe included more office holders than Continental Europe and South Europe would do. Hence, we might say that both Scandinavian and post-2004 accession countries sought to filter the European project through national lenses. The image of the EU as a bureaucratic institution has resonated in its visual representation in campaign videos, where the European flag had occurred in 1/5 of them, followed by politicians being involved in 7% of all videos, buildings with 5.6%, and maps being taken solely for 4.7%. It seems that 2/3 of the videos covered some form of the EU evaluation, being either positive 30.7%, negative 22.6%, or neutral 22.3%. Now, when it comes to posters used in the 2014 campaign, any of those which marked politicians present in Eastern and Northern Europe featured candidates in much higher fraction, with 75% and 67% respectively, than those from Continental and Southern Europe. What's more, campaign posters from Eastern Europe were notable for their use of visual representations of their member states. The most recurrent depiction was for the most part national flags, made visible in 14% of posters in Eastern Europe as compared to 9% in Continental Europe and only just 4% in Southern Europe. When evaluating the EU, Continental Europe ceased to house a strident debate, with Eastern Europe being neutral positive and Northern Europe seen as neutral negative. The themes in campaign posters offer a glimpse into the concerns of the 4 European areas raised in the present video. The issue of labour was more intermittent in the well-off regions of continental and northern Europe, with 7% and 6% of posters. Given the impact of EU-level decisions in the peripheral economies of Europe, some policies were more frequently referred to from southern Europe, with 8% in the ballpark. Continental and northern Europe were indeed on similar ground if we would consider the impact of adversity on both regions, whereby 1/3 of the posters fell into this category, whereas 25% was limited to southern Europe. The economic turmoil, which began in 2008 in the United States and spread across Europe, has fueled Euroscepticism in several member states that had previously supported European integration. In order to avoid any misapprehension, this section endeavours to present Eurobarometer data from October 2004 used as a reference to generate a division between Eurosceptic and Europhile countries. By way of illustration, those member states, namely Croatia, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, the UK, Sweden, Finland and Latvia, with an approval of 50%, are to be considered as Eurosceptic, while those above 50% are regarded as Europhile. Although European elections offered a great opportunity to express antagonistic views in regard to the EU, the Eurosceptics did show hostility to the commercials in EU-friendly countries. Notwithstanding, contingency was prone to occur in EU institutions, which were higher in Eurosceptic countries, with 12% than in Europhile states. Although Eurosceptics often handled the serious issue with their mainstream competitors, divergence in attacks towards national political parties did not carry heavy weight. Campaign videos in both Eurosceptic and Europhile countries did not differ in their focus on national items. The similarities between Eurosceptic and Europhile countries persist when taking into consideration the presence of European items in commercials. The EU showed up as a core issue in 12% of spots, particularly in Eurosceptic countries, and in 14% in Europhile countries. Anti-Euro sentiments were hardly noticeable in conventional Europhile countries than they were in Eurosceptic states. Beyond doubt, the visual representations of the member states were more frequent in Europhile countries in comparison to Eurosceptic states. This is also true regarding the recurrence of national flags in videos. 16.6% in Eurosceptic countries and 22% in Europhile states. The pro-EU member states also accounted for more visual aids, with 38% in Europhile states and 24% in Eurosceptic states. This convergence might be reflected in the depiction of European flags, which were featured in 21% of videos from Europhile countries, but only 13% from Eurosceptic states. Following the same pattern, posters in 2014 European Parliament campaign provided almost the same path when bearing comparison between Eurosceptic and Europhile countries. Posters from Europhile states demonstrated over 20% of them, compared to 14% in Eurosceptic countries. It stands to reason that EU-critical nations were keen on making verbal references to territories, either to their own member states or else to Europe in general, than to demonyms like "we the Polish" and "we the Europeans." Topically, the issues raised in the posters did not differ to a great degree, since there was little room for labour in the posters of Eurosceptic countries than those of Europhile nations. Likewise, other issues as development, unemployment and European policies offered similar proportions in both groups. Even the anti-Euro sentiment was relatively similar in its characterization in the campaign posters, with 3.2% for Eurosceptics and 2.2% for Europhile countries. Our in-depth analysis has proven that Eurosceptic nations were more or less negative by presenting approximately 30% of the posters than in Europhile countries with 25%, alongside EU institutions capturing perilous attacks illustrated in 19% of posters from Eurosceptic countries and 12% of them from Europhile member states. During the European financial crisis, the peripheral member states of the EU were derisively labelled as pigs, viz. Portugal, Ireland, Greece and Spain. Divided between its industrial north and its lesser competitive south, Italy was added to the group by doubling the I in the acronym, therefore becoming the fifth troubled economy that threatened the survival of the euro as a viable currency. In the subsequent section, we tend to compare these maligned debtor countries to some of their main creditors, most notably to France, Germany and the UK. One of the key differences between debtor and creditor countries was the retreat to real-life stories among the former group. Dramatizations of personal testimonies account for 35% of videos from the PIGS, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece and Spain group, where they simply represent 10% of videos in creditor member states. There has been twice as much disapproval in videos from debtor countries, with 31% which were classified as negative attack, than in videos from the creditor triad, 15%. In consequence, the focus of the skepticism was not shifted towards Europe or even the EU, instead towards the national political establishment. Both European and national politicians were unquestionably less attacked in videos from the PIGS countries than in those from creditor states. National political parties were addressed negatively in 1/5 of videos from debtor countries with 20% in our sample, but only 6% of videos from creditor states. The national government was attacked in PIGS commercials with 16%, but only 9% of the videos were produced by parties in creditor states. In other respects, EU institutions were criticized in videos produced in debtor countries with 14%, but 6% of videos from creditor member states. The creditor countries, that is to say Britain, France and Germany, stressed the limited national focus that featured 21% in their commercials when comparing the debtor countries with the rest of the countries. Despite the dread effects of the bankruptcy and the attention paid to the euro in wider public discourse, our key findings have sought to present the debate as one that is more nationally bound to most afflicted countries. The videos of debtor and creditor member states have surely some similarities as perceived through the prism of political advertising, yet they hold quite a few differences. Both fronts of countries have been alike given the weight they provide to labour issues in the EU. Yet the two groups might differ sharply in the relevance they give to development and unemployment. Needless to say that the anti-euro sentiment has been equally shared by debtors with 8% and 7% of creditors, indicative of the disgust of the common currency shared by debtors and creditors, or else a lack of identification between the crisis and the monetary union. Austerity policies in the infected countries hardly left anyone untouched. It should be noted that the commercials from PIGS countries were remarkably more emotional than those from the creditor nations. Anger strikes as being prevalent in the debtor commercials with 19% and creditor countries by having 15% than in the rest of member states in the sample. This could be suggestive of a mutual animosity between debtors and creditors. Fear or enthusiasm have been similarly present in both groups. Although the visual presence of the EU is roughly similar in the two groups, the member states have been far more distinguishable in the PIGS videos with 62% than in campaign spots from creditor nations with 23%. When evaluated, the EU accounts for a similar proportion of positive appraisals in 1/3 of the videos from both groups. When viewed negatively though, the debtor countries outpace creditor nations, if only little. The EU has been assessed in 32% of the videos from PIGS countries and in 25% from the creditor member states. The posters brought from these countries showcase that leaders, national politicians, were present in 1/4 of posters through 24%, whereas posters emphasize 43% coming from debtor countries. In the same spirit, national items dominate the focus of the posters in debtor countries with 44%. Creditor countries, on the other hand, were more European-oriented, with 1/3 of the posters dealing with European or international topics. Europe was measured in some other form in half of the posters, but it was in the group of creditor countries where this assessment was more negative, with 27%, including a criticism of the EU and/or its institutions. In this inquiry, we have found that negative advertising has been more common among debt or member states underscoring 36% and creditor countries 41% than in posters in the rest of the representative sample with 20%. One of the main justifications of such negativity could be palpable in the EU itself, which was attacked in 13% of all the posters. In debtor nations, this proportion has been on a small scale greater, while having 16% and far higher among creditor countries with 23%. As a result, trust in the EU declined deliberately across all member states during the crisis. And so, by using content analysis data from posters and commercials in 2014, our comparative study aims to draw parallels between traditionally Eurosceptic and Europhile countries and also highlighting their discrepancies. The geographic divisions between a debtor periphery, mostly from Southern Europe, and a creditor centre from continental and Northern Europe were also to be verified in the political communication of the parties. Although several analysts blame the deficient monetary regime of the single currency for much of the economic difficulties marring the Eurozone, the euro was not in truth the sole object of critique in the posters and TV advertisements in the 2014 elections. Our findings show that the political elites, being either European or national, have taken most of the rhetorical blows.